The descent into Oakhaven began not with the expected rush of a homecoming, but with a peculiar silence. My small charter plane, a rattling relic, deposited me onto a tarmac that felt strangely abandoned. The pilot, a man whose face was etched with the weariness of too many solitary flights, simply pointed towards the terminal building and mumbled something about a waiting car before turning back to his engine. I watched him go, a shiver tracing my spine despite the mild autumn air. Inside, the chill deepened. I found myself in an empty airport concourse with motionless escalators, a vast, echoing space that swallowed the sound of my rolling suitcase. Dust motes danced in the anemic light filtering through the high windows, illuminating the stillness of the place. The escalators, twin metal rivers frozen mid-flow, ascended into a gloom that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. No cheerful announcements, no distant chatter, no rumble of luggage carts. It was less an airport, more a forgotten monument to transit, a gateway that had ceased to function decades ago. A faint, metallic tang, like old coins and disused machinery, hung in the air. I peered into the vacant offices that lined the concourse, their glass walls reflecting only my own solitary figure, distorted and elongated. A profound sense of isolation settled upon me, a premonition that this journey back to Oakhaven would be unlike any I had imagined. The drive into Oakhaven was a blur of muted greens and grays, the landscape hushed and watchful. The rental car, a nondescript sedan, felt like a bubble of fragile normalcy in a world growing increasingly strange. My grandmother's death, cryptic and sudden, had been the catalyst. The call from the local constable had been brief, devoid of details, just the stark fact of her demise and the arrangements for a quiet ceremony. As the road narrowed, transitioning from asphalt to the cracked, winding lanes I remembered, the trees thickened, their branches interlacing overhead to form a perpetual twilight. The air grew heavy, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something vaguely saline, like old tears. A tension began to coil in my gut, a nervous energy that vibrated beneath my skin. Then, Oakhaven. It wasn't the town I remembered, not truly. The familiar storefronts of Main Street stood, their paint faded, their windows reflecting nothing. The general store, the old cinema, the small diner, all seemed to be holding their breath. There were no children playing, no distant shouts, no rumble of engines. A profound, unnatural stillness draped itself over everything, muffling the world. My tires crunched on gravel, the sound startlingly loud in the pervasive quiet. I saw them then, the townsfolk. A handful of figures, scattered like forgotten chess pieces. An elderly woman sweeping the porch of what used to be the bakery, her movements slow, methodical, almost robotic. A man tending a small patch of garden, his back to me, utterly absorbed in the task, unmoving even as my car passed. They didn't wave, didn't glance up. Their stillness was unnerving. I parked near the small, white-steepled church where the funeral was to be held, its doors closed, a single wreath of withered flowers adorning it. The quiet was absolute, save for the distant, rhythmic creak of a weather vane spinning in a phantom breeze. I walked towards the church, my footsteps echoing on the worn cobblestones. He was the constable, I presumed, the same voice from the phone. He acknowledged my presence with a curt nod, his face unreadable, his eyes a flat, dull gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. There was no warmth, no sympathy, not even a flicker of recognition for my return. "Cole," he stated, his voice a low. "It's today?" He nodded slowly. His gaze drifting past me, fixed on some unseen point down the empty street. "Soon enough. She's ready." His words, "she's ready," hung in the air, a peculiar choice of phrasing. It wasn't "we're ready" or "the service is ready," but a possessive, almost proprietary tone. About my grandmother. A prickle of unease started low in my stomach. Other townsfolk began to gather, drifting towards the church from various directions. They moved with a peculiar languor, their steps silent, their faces uniformly reserved. Their expressions were not of grief, nor even solemnity, but something else entirely, a profound emptiness, a quietude that felt less like peace and more like absence. Their eyes, when they occasionally flickered towards me, held no curiosity, no spark of recognition. They simply looked through me, as if I were a ghost already, or perhaps, as if they themselves were. This wasn't just a town in mourning. I felt a distinct sensation then, a subtle pressure on the back of my neck, as if 1,000 unseen eyes were watching me, not with malice, but with a detached, pervasive scrutiny, like an insect under glass. The air itself seemed to hum with their silent observation. Oakhaven had changed, and something within its quiet depths had changed them all. And I, Cole, had returned to its strange, watchful embrace. They lingered in the air, a final, unsettling benediction as the coffin, dark and polished, began its slow descent. Their faces, etched with the familiar lines of Oakhaven's weathered inhabitants, held expressions I couldn't quite decipher, a placidness that bordered on vacant. No tears welled, no shoulders shook with quiet grief. Only a collective, muted stillness. This wasn't how I remembered funerals in Oakhaven. There was always a quiet murmur of shared memories, a communal sigh of loss. I watched the undertaker, his movements precise and unhurried, as he signaled the gravediggers. Then, turning from the fresh mound of earth, I sought out a familiar face. A distant cousin, a woman named Maeve, stood a little apart from the others, her hands clasped tightly at her waist. His silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and his eyes, usually quick with a sharp wit, seemed glazed, distant. "Maeve," I murmured, stepping towards him, "it's Cole." His brow furrowed, a faint crease appearing between his eyes. "Yes, Cole. You've grown. Haven't seen you since, well, it's been a while, hasn't it?" "Years," I confirmed, a knot tightening in my chest. "Since before university, I think." I wanted to ask, about grandmother. Was it sudden? Maeve's eyes darted away, fixed on a distant point beyond the cemetery gates. Sudden? I suppose so. These things often are, aren't they? Her voice was flat, devoid of the usual Oakhaven inflection. One day he was, and the next. She wasn't. But what happened? I pressed gently, my determination to understand clashing with the growing unease. The undertaker wouldn't say much. Just that it was her time. She finally looked back at me, her expression unreadable. Her time, yes. That's what they say. He was old, Cole. Very old. A shrug, slight and dismissive, he had a good life, I imagine. A good life? My grandmother, a fierce, vibrant woman who gardened with the tenacity of a badger and argued politics with the ferocity of a wildcat, had been reduced to he was old? It felt wrong. Her life, though long, had been punctuated by specific, memorable events, not a vague, gentle fading. I remembered a fall she'd taken a few years ago, a bad one that had kept her bedridden for weeks. "Do you remember when she broke her hip?" I asked, testing the waters. It was quite the ordeal. Maeve tilted her head. Did she? I don't recall that. He was always so spry. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, fleeting and without warmth. Always busy. Always something to do. My stomach clenched. I distinctly remembered visiting her in the small cottage, the cast on her leg, the frustration in her eyes. How could Maeve, her own cousin, forget such a significant event? I moved on, seeking out an old-school friend, a man named Silas, who now worked at the general store. He was talking in low tones with another townsman, both of them wearing the same placid, unreadable expressions. "Silas," I greeted, extending a hand. "It's Cole. Remember me?" He turned, his eyes widening slightly. "Cole. Well, I'll be. You're back." He shook my hand, his grip surprisingly limp. "Didn't think we'd see you again." "I had to come back for grandmother's funeral," I explained, trying to keep my voice even. "It's been too long." "Too long," he echoed, his gaze drifting over my shoulder. "Yes. Time flies, doesn't it?" "It does," I agreed. "I was just talking to Maeve. She seems to have forgotten a lot about grandmother. Do you remember her much, Silas?" He paused, a peculiar blankness descending over his features. "Your grandmother?" "Of course. She lived down by the old mill, didn't she?" My grandmother had lived in the same cottage on Elm Street, up on the hill, for as long as I could remember. The old mill had been abandoned for decades, a crumbling ruin on the outskirts of town. The rock candy was a distant, hazy memory, something I associated with the town's former mayor, not my grandmother. Silas, she lived on Elm Street. Quickly replaced by that same unsettling placidity. Did she? Well, my memory isn't what it used to be, I suppose. Blurs together after a while, you know? Everything blurs together. The phrase struck me with the force of a physical blow. It was more than forgetfulness, it was a deliberate erasure, a subtle shift in the fabric of their recollections. The memory, if it was a memory, felt both familiar and utterly alien, a place of transition where all journeys had ceased. It was an image of stasis, of departures that never happened, of arrivals that never materialized. My own memories, sharp and vivid moments of my childhood in Oakhaven, suddenly felt fragile, like brittle glass. Was I the one misremembering? Had I conjured these details, these specific anecdotes, from the ether? The thought was terrifying, a betrayal from my own mind. I tried a few more people. An elderly woman who had been a close friend of my grandmother's for decades. A man who owned the hardware store, who I remembered playing chess with my grandmother every Tuesday. Each conversation yielded the same disquieting results, vague recollections, shifting details, an inability to recall specific events, and a pervasive, gentle amnesia that seemed to have settled over Oakhaven like a perpetual fog. They remembered my grandmother, yes, but only in the broadest, most generic strokes. They remembered me, but only as a specter from a distant past, a face without context. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges, but the colors held no warmth for me. My grandmother's death was not a simple tragedy. It was a crack in the foundation of this town, revealing a terrifying truth: Oakhaven was forgetting itself, one memory, one person, at a time. And I, the outsider, the one who remembered, was beginning to feel the terrifying pull of that collective oblivion, wondering how long it would be before my own mind began to blur. The chill in my grandmother's house was not merely the cold breath of an autumn morning, it was the lingering touch of something far older, far more desolate. Each floorboard groaned a forgotten lament under my weight as I moved through the rooms, the air thick with the scent of dust and dried lavender, a faint echo of her final, bewildered days. The townsfolk's fractured memories still gnawed at the edges of my own perception, a subtle discord that hummed just beneath the surface of my thoughts. Everything truly did blur together, not just for them, but threatening to for me too, if I wasn't careful. I began my grim task in her study, a small chamber crammed with leather-bound books and trinkets collected from a lifetime I barely knew. Sunlight, thin and pale, struggled through the grimy window panes, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air like tiny, lost spirits. I ran my hand over the smooth, cold surface of her mahogany desk, a relic heavy with secrets. My fingers, hesitant at first, then more determined, sifted through the detritus of a life. I was searching for something, though I couldn't articulate what. A sign. A clue. Something to explain the emptiness I felt in the town, the unsettling uniformity in their gazes, the way their recollections seemed to have been smoothed over, like stones worn down by an unseen river. Beneath a stack of old land deeds, tucked away in the deepest corner of a bottom drawer, my knuckles brushed against an unexpected rigidity. Not paper, but something harder, bound. I pulled it free, a small, leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by countless touches. It felt ancient in my hands, its edges softened by time, its clasp a tarnished silver. No title adorned its cover, only a single, intricate symbol etched into the leather, a spiraling pattern that seemed to draw the eye inward, a labyrinthine design both elegant and deeply unsettling. It was not one of her usual elegant script, but something primal, almost glyph-like. My fingers trembled as I unfastened the clasp. The pages within were thick, cream-colored, and brittle. The first entries were neat, mundane observations of garden blooms and weather patterns, a chronicle of Oakhaven's quiet rhythms from decades past. But as I turned the pages, the handwriting began to change, growing more erratic, the strokes heavier, sometimes almost frantic. They are not sounds, not truly, but a pressure behind the eyes, a gentle nudge at the edges of thought. The miller's wife spoke of a dream she couldn't quite recall, only a feeling of vastness, of being part of something larger, yet utterly alone. I swallowed, a dry, metallic taste in my mouth. This was it. The confirmation. Further entries plunged deeper into a growing unease. November 3rd. The forgetting spreads. Small things at first. a name, a date. Then larger gaps. The baker swore he'd never seen the old oak by the river, though it has stood there since Oakhaven was founded. Their eyes, they seemed to lose a certain light. My breath hitched. The description mirrored exactly what I had witnessed. The journal became a testament to a slow, insidious erosion. Interspersed with the increasingly agitated script were crude, yet unnerving, sketches of the same spiraling symbol from the cover, drawn with a furious intensity, sometimes filling an entire page. Below one such drawing, he had scrawled the heart of it. The coil that binds us all. Then came a passage that made the air in the room feel suddenly thin, the walls press in. December 12th. It speaks of the town's founding. Not in words, but in a resonance within the bone. Our ancestors, they knew. They built upon it, a terrible pact, thinking to contain it. But it merely waited. It is the root, the unseen anchor. Our family, we were meant to be the guardians. The keepers of memory. But what if the memory itself is the meal? A sudden, disorienting lurch seized me, a violent tremor in my perception. The musty scent of the study vanished, replaced by a sterile, metallic tang. The pages of the journal blurred, melting into a vast, empty space. The silence was absolute, heavier than any I had ever known, the kind of silence that swallows sound whole, leaving only the echo of your own frantic heartbeat. Glass walls stretched into a hazy distance, reflecting nothing, offering no view. The escalators stood frozen, their teeth glinting dully under the dim, artificial light, leading nowhere, ascending to nothing. The sheer, desolate emptiness was a physical weight, pressing down, threatening to erase my own presence from the space. Then, just as suddenly, the vision snapped shut. The scent of dust returned, the cool, familiar leather of the journal was solid in my grip. I gasped, pulling myself back to the present, my heart hammering against my ribs. They are from within. And they are hungry. My grandmother knew. He had seen it, felt it, fought it. The ancient entity beneath Oakhaven, feeding on collective memory, slowly assimilating its inhabitants. The final words of my grandmother's journal clawed at the lining of my skull, a cold, insistent echo. A new kind of silence settled over the room, not the familiar hush of the old house, but a suffocating absence, as if the very air had been drained of its voice. A dry rustle, like leaves skittering over ancient stone, brushed against my inner ear. Nothing. Yet, the sound persisted, a breathy, formless murmur, just beyond the grasp of comprehension. It was like trying to recall a dream upon waking, the essence there, but the details dissolving into vapor. I tried to shake it off, to attribute it to the strain of the revelation, the lack of sleep. But then, a smudge at the periphery of my vision, a fleeting, formless ripple in the air, a momentary deepening of the gloom against the wall. I blinked, turning my head sharply, and it was gone. Just a trick of light, I told myself, a tired mind playing games. I needed to move, to see, to understand if this insidious influence was truly as pervasive as my grandmother's scrawled warnings suggested. Clutching the journal, its secrets still burning under my fingertips, I stepped out into the crisp Oakhaven morning. The town square, usually a quiet hum of activity, felt strangely muted. I frowned. The baker, a stout man with flour always dusting his apron, was an early riser, a fixture. I walked past the general store. The proprietor, a man whose face was a roadmap of Oakhaven's history, usually greeted me with a nod and a comment about the weather. Today, he merely stared, his eyes wide and unfocused, as if peering through a veil. He didn't offer a word, didn't even seem to register my presence. I overheard fragments of conversation near the docks, where a few working-class residents were mending nets. And she just. They wasn't there, one voice murmured, low and flat. No note, no word. But then, no one seems to remember her being here at all, do they? The other voice merely grunted, a sound devoid of agreement or disagreement, utterly empty. No one pressed the issue. No one questioned the sudden, phantom disappearance. They seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the town, from the weathered clapboard houses, from the salt-laced air itself. I instinctively veered away, my skin prickling. An old, forgotten road, overgrown with tenacious weeds, beckoned towards the outskirts. It led, I vaguely remembered, to what had once been a small, regional airport, abandoned decades ago when the larger city hub had rendered it obsolete. Why it called to me now, I couldn't say, but the pull was undeniable, a silent promise of answers, or perhaps, just a deeper quiet. Finally, the skeletal remains of the terminal building loomed into view, a concrete husk against the bruised sky. They stood like monuments to a future that never arrived, their metallic scales gleaming dully, leading to nowhere. Mine, ours. My eyes scanned the vast space, settling on a faded, sun-bleached poster still clinging to a wall near a defunct gate. It depicted a smiling family, their faces bright and hopeful, advertising a flight to a city far away. Below it, half obscured by a fallen ceiling tile, lay a child's forgotten toy airplane, its plastic wings snapped, its paint chipped away. It wasn't just discarded, it felt left behind, abruptly, in a moment of panic or haste. The motionless escalators seemed to mock me, their promise of ascent forever unfulfilled. The air here was thick with unspoken things, with the weight of unacknowledged departures. Forgotten, erased. My grandmother had been right. The entity was not merely present, it was actively consuming, its tendrils reaching out, slowly, inexorably, to erase Oakhaven, one memory, one person, at a time. They were the entity's breath, its touch, its hunger. The disappearances were real. The entity was active. And I was standing in its maw. The wind, a cold, unfeeling whisper, tugged at my collar as I stood before the old mill. This was where her final, frantic entry had led me, a jagged sketch of a symbol, identical to the ones etched into the ancient stones beneath the town's oldest bridge, accompanied by the single, scrawled word, mill. A rusted chain, thick as a man's forearm, hung from the main double doors, its links fused by decades of neglect. I tested it, the metal cold and unyielding against my gloved hand. With a grunt, I braced myself and put my shoulder into the warped wood, once, then twice. The interior was a cathedral of decay. Massive wooden gears, once vital, now lay prone, their teeth gnawed by time and dampness. The air here was heavier, imbued with the metallic tang of rust and the cloying sweetness of rot. My boots crunched on fallen debris, shards of glass, fragments of ceramic, and something else, something fibrous and soft that crumbled to powder underfoot. I moved slowly, my gaze sweeping across the chaos, searching for any pattern, any anomaly that might align with the cryptic symbols. The silence was not truly silent, it hummed with the slow, deliberate decay of matter, the incessant, tiny gnawing of unseen things. The vast, echoing space was devoid of human presence, yet it felt heavy with absence, a place where memories had been meticulously scrubbed clean. Then, just as quickly, the vision fractured, leaving only the smell of rot and rust, the tangible grit of the mill floor beneath my feet. The entity wasn't just out there, it was capable of reaching in. Pushing past the disorienting flicker, I continued deeper, drawn by a faint, almost imperceptible shift in the air, a coolness that suggested a draft from somewhere below. The back wall of the mill, constructed from rough-hewn stone rather than timber, appeared older, more resilient to the ravages of time. As I drew closer, running my fingers over the rough surface, the texture changed. Beneath layers of accumulated grime and lichen, a series of deliberate indentations began to emerge. I scraped away decades of organic matter with my knife, revealing the stone beneath. There they were, undeniable, carved with a precision that defied the passage of centuries. Spirals that coiled inward upon themselves, lines that intersected at impossible angles, and the central, unsettling motif, a cluster of radiating points, like a star whose light was being devoured rather than emitted. My grandmother's journal, clutched in my other hand, fell open to the page I'd marked. The crude drawing, hurried and desperate, was an exact match. Every curve, every sharp angle, mirrored on the ancient stone. He had found this place. He had understood. As my eyes traced the final, intricate pattern, a section of the wall, subtly different in its construction, caught my attention. It was a block, larger than the others, framed by the carvings, almost perfectly camouflaged. I pressed against it, then pushed, then leaned with all my weight. A low groan, deeper than the mill's usual lament, emanated from the stone. Dust rained down, thick and choking, as the block slowly, grudgingly, pivoted inward. It was a scent that spoke of forgotten depths, of something vast and patient waiting beneath the surface. This was it. The next step. The passage into the heart of Oakhaven's affliction. Whatever lay beneath, whatever ancient hunger had begun to consume my home, I would face it. The old mill, a gaunt sentinel against the encroaching twilight, had offered its secrets with a grudging sigh of rusted hinges. Beneath the grinding stones, where the river's ceaseless churn once powered Oakhaven's industry, a concealed hatch lay buried beneath decades of dust and forgotten grain. I pried it open, the metallic shriek echoing in the hollow space, a sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of the silence itself. The descent was immediate, a rough-hewn passage dropping steeply into the bedrock. This was no mere cellar. This was a deliberate excavation, a wound carved deep into the earth. The passage twisted, a serpentine coil unwinding into the earth's belly. The walls, slick with a perpetual dampness, were not natural rock formations. I traced the rough marks of tools, crude and inefficient, suggesting a labor of immense, desperate effort. Here and there, strange symbols were etched into the stone, not letters or pictograms I recognized, but swirling patterns, spirals that seemed to draw the eye inward, promising an endless fall. My fingers brushed against a patch of growth, not moss, but something pale and fibrous, like threadbare cobwebs spun from bone. The tunnel opened into a cavernous chamber, vast and echoing. The air here was different, still and heavy, carrying a faint, cloying sweetness, like decaying flowers or forgotten incense. The floor was uneven, strewn with debris, and as my beam swept across it, I saw them. Bones. Not scattered animal remains, but deliberately arranged clusters, bleached and brittle. They were unmistakably human, small and fragile, suggesting children. The implication hung in the air, a sickening pall. The ancient inhabitants of Oakhaven had offered something, or someone, to the depths. I pressed on, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, each beat a frantic drum signaling my trespass. The passage narrowed again, then widened unexpectedly into a space that defied logic. My flashlight beam faltered, then steadied, revealing an impossible tableau. The floor was polished tile, reflecting the weak glow of my light in 1,000 fractured points. Rows of seats, molded plastic in faded primary colors, sat vacant and silent. The escalators, their metal teeth interlocked and still, ascended into an unseen ceiling, a frozen river of departure. There was no dust, no decay, no sign of the earth that should have surrounded it. It was utterly pristine, utterly out of place. This was not real. It could not be. Yet, my eyes registered the details, the precise lines of the architecture, the faint hum that seemed to emanate from the motionless machinery. Was this a trick of the mind, a memory dredged from the collective unconscious and projected onto the cavern walls? Or was it something far more sinister, a physical manifestation born of the entity's power, a place of passage frozen in time, its purpose aborted? I moved forward, my steps tentative, echoing unnaturally on the tiled floor. The air here held a faint, metallic tang, like ozone before a storm. There were no signs of life, no discarded boarding passes, no forgotten luggage. Only the stark, impossible geometry of a place built for movement, now utterly inert. As I neared the escalators, a low, guttural thrum began to vibrate through the floor, a sound that resonated deep within my bones. It was not mechanical, it was organic, a slow, rhythmic pulse. The air grew thick, humid, and a new scent assaulted me, earthy, but also sweet and sickly, like raw meat left in the sun. It clung to the rock face, a grotesque growth of mottled gray and black, glistening with an internal moisture. Tendrils, thick as a man's arm, snaked out from its core, burrowing into the surrounding stone, disappearing into unseen crevices. The pulsing was constant, a slow, heavy thump-thump, like a monstrous heart beating deep within the earth. This was it. The source. The physical presence. My mind reeled, struggling to reconcile the impossible concourse with this undeniable, living horror. The entity was not merely a memory eater, it was a physical presence, a grotesque, organic parasite embedded in the very foundations of Oakhaven. This was no longer a mystery to be solved with logic. And I had descended right into its maw. The old mill's breath was a frigid, metallic exhalation as I descended. The hatch, a rusted maw in the floor beneath the ancient grinding stones, creaked its protest, then swallowed the last vestiges of twilight. Darkness, thick and absolute, pressed in, a physical weight that stole the air from my lungs. My flashlight beam, a nervous tremor, cut a trembling path through the gloom, revealing rough-hewn rock walls slick with an oily dampness, and a stairwell that spiraled into the earth's maw. Each step I took echoed, a solitary declaration against an overwhelming silence. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of wet earth, iron, and something else, a faint, cloying sweetness, like forgotten fruit or decaying flowers. It clung to my clothes, seeped into my skin. My breath hitched, a ragged sound in the profound quiet. I could feel the pulse in my temples, a frantic drum against the encroaching stillness. Then, a faint luminescence. Not light, not truly, but a diffuse, internal glow that pulsed with a slow, deliberate rhythm from deeper within. It drew me, an irresistible current in the subterranean river of my fear. I moved with a heightened caution, my boots scraping softly on the rock, each sound amplified, distorted. And there, bathed in that ethereal, throbbing glow, was the gathering. They stood, a silent tableau, arranged in concentric circles around a central, shimmering focal point that seemed to drink the very air. The glow emanated from this core, a living, breathing nebula of faint, shifting light. My flashlight beam, useless against the pervasive glow, dropped to my side, its small circle of defiance extinguished. The elderly shopkeeper, whose hands once trembled as he counted change, stood with a serene, terrifying stillness. The baker, his flour-dusted apron now a gray shroud, his robust frame unnaturally gaunt. Even the quiet elder from the town council, usually so stoic and contained, was among them, his eyes wide and unseeing. Their faces were slack, devoid of expression, yet not peaceful. It was a terrifying vacancy, a surrender. Their eyes, though open, held no individual light, only the reflection of the pulsing glow. They were not speaking, not moving, not even truly breathing, it seemed. Yet, a soundless hum resonated through the cavern, vibrating in my bones, in the very marrow of my being. As I watched, a shudder passed through the collective. A wave of shared emotion, not my own, washed over me, a profound melancholy, then a fleeting burst of joy, quickly subsumed by a deep, abiding quietude. I saw images flicker at the edge of my mind's eye, fragmented and alien, a child's forgotten toy, a summer afternoon by a long dry creek, a faint, sweet scent of honeysuckle. These were not my memories, yet they pulsed within me, resonant and strange. They were the discarded echoes of lives, now pooled into something vast and indistinct. They were feeding it. This pulsating core, this silent entity, was not merely consuming their minds, it was assimilating them. A memory, perhaps, of some lost journey, now just a discarded fragment, floating in this vast, hungry mind. It was desolate, lonely, and yet, held a strange, unsettling peace. Then the pull began. It offered a boundless quiet, emerging into something vast and ancient, where the sharp edges of self would soften, then dissolve. My grandmother's face, a fleeting, sorrowful image, drifted through the shared consciousness, then was gone, consumed. My limbs felt heavy, my mind light, eager to unmoor itself, to float free. To join. To finally rest. It was a seductive oblivion, a profound, beckoning quiet. My eyes began to drift, drawn to the shimmering heart of the cavern, to the vacant faces of the townsfolk, their stillness and enviable peace. No. The thought was a tiny, desperate spark in the encroaching fog, a defiance against the rising tide of shared consciousness. My grandmother's cryptic words, her frantic warnings, echoed, not from the collective, but from the dwindling core of myself. This was not peace, it was erasure. This was not unity, it was consumption. With a monumental effort, a violent wrenching of will against the seductive current, I forced my eyes shut, blocking the mesmerizing glow. I stumbled backward, a clumsy, frantic retreat, the sound of my boots on the rock a jarring discord against the silent hum. I had seen the collective mind, and it had almost claimed my own. But it was not merely the absence of light that suffocated, it was a presence, vast and unseen, that coiled around me the moment my feet touched the damp earth of the tunnel floor. A low, resonant hum began, not in my ears, but deep within my bones, vibrating through the very marrow. It was the sound of 1,000 voices speaking as one, yet utterly silent, a cacophony of lost thoughts echoing in the hollow chambers of my skull. I felt a gentle tug, a subtle invitation, like a tide pulling at a pebble on the shore. It promised peace, an end to the agonizing burden of individuality, a soft dissolution into something infinitely larger, infinitely quiet. My own memories, sharp as shards of glass a moment before, began to blur at the edges, softening into a warm, indistinct haze. This was not the promise of death, but something far more insidious. This was an erasure, a silent consumption of the self, a forced assimilation into a boundless, undifferentiated consciousness. It sought not my life, but my me. The horror of it sharpened my senses, cut through the mesmerizing hum. I could not simply cease to be coal, I could not become another voiceless current in that vast, subterranean river of forgotten minds. My hand scrabbled along the rough-hewn wall, seeking purchase, seeking escape. The tunnel was a winding gut of the earth, damp and smelling of ancient soil and something else, a faint, sweet decay, like forgotten flowers. The hum intensified, pushing against my resolve, urging me to surrender. I pictured the blank faces of the townsfolk, the vacant stares, the fractured narratives, and understood, truly understood, the entity's true hunger. It fed not on blood or flesh, but on the very essence of memory, on the unique tapestry of each life. It was not a killer, it was a thief of souls, leaving behind only husks, puppets animated by its own vast, collective will. I stumbled forward, blindly, the air growing heavy, thick with the entity's silent persuasion. My heart hammered against my ribs, a desperate drumbeat against the encroaching stillness. My grandmother's face, clear and defiant in my mind's eye, became an anchor. Her warnings, her research, her final, cryptic words, they were not for naught. A faint glimmer, a crack of gray light, appeared ahead, a distant promise of the world above. I surged towards it, breath ragged, limbs heavy as lead, each step a battle against the invisible current dragging me back. The tunnel narrowed, then opened into a small, vertical shaft. I clawed my way up, desperate, my fingers finding purchase on ancient, slippery rocks. I burst through a hidden opening behind the old mill, gasping, collapsing onto the dew-kissed grass. The moon, a sliver of bone in the velvet sky, looked down upon Oakhaven. The town was silent, slumbering under the entity's silent dominion. I could almost feel its vast, unseen network humming beneath the earth, a web of stolen thoughts and fractured identities. I pushed myself up, my body trembling, but my mind, though frayed, was clearer than it had been in days. I had almost dissolved, almost become another faceless echo. I needed distance, a place utterly devoid of the entity's reach, to think. The air was stale, echoing with the ghosts of hurried footsteps and disembodied announcements. My hands, still trembling, fumbled in my bag for my grandmother's research. The worn leather-bound journal, the cryptic diagrams, the faded photographs, they were my only hope. The entity did not kill, it assimilated. The collective was its true form, its strength. My grandmother's notes, scrawled in her elegant, precise hand, spoke of nodes, of conduits, of a central nexus. He had known its nature, had understood its method. My plan began to coalesce, grim and desperate. If the entity fed on collective memory, if it drew its strength from the assimilation of individuality, then the key lay in severing its connection to the source, to the town itself. It was not about destroying it, for how could one destroy a consciousness? It was about isolating it, starving it, cutting off its access to the very memories it craved. My grandmother's research hinted at ancient rituals, at specific geographical points, at methods of disruption. It was a dangerous, audacious gamble. I was alone, pitted against an ancient, hungry intelligence that had already consumed an entire town. But I would not become another lost whisper in its endless, silent dream. I would fight. Air from my lungs. The descent had been a physical unraveling, each step on the rusted rungs echoing the collapse of my certainties. But the bottom was not the damp earth I expected, nor the churning machinery I'd braced myself for. Instead, the absolute dark, oppressing, velvet weight, yielded with a sickening lurch, and I tumbled forward, not onto stone, but into a vast, chilling expanse. A low hum, a resonant frequency that vibrated in my molars, was the first sensation to pierce the void. Then, a faint, sickly luminescence began to bloom, not from a source, but seemingly from the air itself, a pallid, internal glow. Dust motes, like frozen stars, hung suspended in the stagnant light, reflecting the eerie glow from polished floors that stretched into an infinite, hazy distance. Gates stood numbered, but no planes waited. The motionless escalators, frozen mid-climb, ascended into an unseen ceiling, monuments to journeys aborted. This was not Oakhaven, not as I knew it, yet it felt like the town's silent, bleeding heart. I stumbled, my hand instinctively reaching for the worn leather of my grandmother's journal, its weight a grounding presence against the unreality of my surroundings. My gaze swept across the silent expanse. Figures. They were there, scattered across the concourse, moving with a uniform slowness, a dreamlike drift. Not quite solid, not quite translucent, their forms blurred at the edges, as if their very existence was being siphoned away. They were the townsfolk, or what remained of them. A woman, her hair once a vibrant crimson, now faded to a dull rust, glided past a row of empty seats. I recognized her, or the echo of her, the baker's wife, who used to press warm turnovers into my hand as a boy. Her eyes, once bright with gossip and good humor, were now like polished stones, reflecting nothing. She didn't pause, didn't turn. Her movements were fluid, effortless, devoid of purpose. He too was lost in the entity's vast, consuming hum. My desperation clawed at me. I raced towards a small cluster of figures near a defunct baggage claim, their forms slightly more defined, their drift a little less uniform. One of them, a young man who worked at the general store, paused, his head tilting almost imperceptibly as I approached. Was it a flicker? A nascent thought breaking through the haze? Michael? I called, louder this time, my voice cracking. Do you remember the old fishing hole? The one we used to sneak off to? The one with the broken sign? His head turned fully towards me, slowly, like a rusted weather vane. For a fleeting instant, his eyes, though still clouded, seemed to focus. A tremor ran through his spectral form. He frowned, a faint, almost forgotten expression. The other figures nearby seemed to stiffen, their silent hum shifting to a lower, more resonant thrum. With the bass. My heart leaped. Yes. The bass. You carved it yourself when you were 10. A jolt, like static electricity, passed through the concourse. The low hum intensified, a hungry growl. Michael's face contorted, a brief battle playing out behind his eyes. He reached out a hand, trembling, towards me. But then, as quickly as it came, the flicker vanished. His eyes glazed over once more, his hand dropping, and he resumed his slow, aimless drift. The air lightened, the hum returned to its steady, insidious rhythm. The entity was fighting back, resisting any spark of individual memory. It was absorbing, dissolving, reducing all to its own silent, homogeneous state. I understood then, it wasn't just taking memories, it was erasing the capacity to remember, to be individual. I retreated to a pillar, pulling the journal from my jacket, my fingers fumbling with the clasp. The pages, brittle and yellowed, felt impossibly ancient in this timeless place. My grandmother's elegant script, usually a comfort, now seemed cryptic, urgent. I flipped past the warnings, the lamentations, searching for a clue, a weakness. It feeds on the threads that bind us, Cole. The shared stories, the personal truths. But a thread, once woven with intent, holds a certain strength. A memory, truly felt, truly recalled, is a discord in its harmony. A stone in its smooth current. I scanned further, my eyes darting across her careful annotations, her frantic marginalia. She spoke of a fissure, a vulnerability at the core of its being, a place where the collective consciousness was most concentrated, yet paradoxically, most fragile. The ritual is not one of sacrifice, but of assertion. Not of forgetting, but of remembering. A single, resonant truth, held with unwavering clarity, can be a spark. Many such sparks, ignited in concert, could be a fire. The old wellspring, the source of Oakhaven's enduring spirit, that is where the veil is thinnest. A shared memory, one that defines us, one that embodies the spirit of Oakhaven, not just its history, but its soul. A relic to anchor it. A symbol of what was, and what must remain. A symbol. A relic. What could embody Oakhaven's soul? Not just a memory, but an object that held that memory. Something common, yet deeply personal to the townsfolk. Something that connected them all before the entity came. The old fishing hole sign Michael almost remembered? Too specific, perhaps. Then, a detail in the margin caught my eye, a small, hastily drawn sketch of an oak leaf, not just any leaf, but one with a distinctive, almost heart-shaped notch. The massive, ancient tree in the town square, older than Oakhaven itself, where generations had carved their initials, left small trinkets, tokens of love, of promises, of grief. Each one a tiny, physical anchor of a personal story, a memory. These weren't just objects, they were fragments of Oakhaven's true, vibrant self. If the entity was a vast, silent consciousness, then these individual tokens, each imbued with a unique, fervent memory, could be like shrapnel, tearing at its fabric. My grandmother wasn't just looking for a way to disrupt it, he was looking for a way to shatter it, piece by piece, by reminding Oakhaven of its own fractured, beautiful, individual self. The tension in the concourse thickened, the hum rising to a low roar. My time here was running out. I had to rally the fragments. The truth, a fragile, shimmering thing, had finally coalesced beneath the gnarled canopy of the whispering oak. Each carved initial, each tarnished locket, each faded ribbon tied to its bark was a whisper, a tether, a small defiance against the encroaching silence. They were anchors, I realized, not just of personal history, but of Oakhaven's very soul. And the entity beneath fed on their absence, on the loosening of those ties. My grandmother's cryptic death, the town's fractured minds, all symptoms of a profound, insidious hunger. The descent was not through a clean tunnel, but a winding, constricted path that felt less like excavation and more like entering the body of something vast and sleeping. The passage opened, not into a cavern of stone, but a chamber of shifting, organic walls. They pulsed with a slow, internal rhythm, a deep thrum that vibrated through the soles of my boots and up into my teeth. My breath hitched. This was no ordinary underground space. This was the entity's dominion, a vast, living lung beneath the earth. They stretched and writhed, momentarily coalescing into forms that were almost familiar, then dissolving into the general gloom. I saw, for a fleeting moment, the silhouette of a child skipping, then the hunched form of an elder by a hearth, then the ghostly outline of a familiar building. Each image was a fragment, a memory torn from its context, flickering in the periphery of my vision like dying embers. It stretched out, vast and silent, under a dome of living rock. The escalators, frozen mid-climb, stood like monuments to abandoned journeys. The air here was utterly still, devoid of the usual airport hum, the distant announcements, the murmur of 1,000 lives in transit. Beyond this phantom concourse, the true core pulsed. It was a vast, amorphous mass, filling the distant end of the chamber, stretching upwards into the unseen ceiling. Within its depths, I saw them, not images, but raw, unfiltered sensations. The warmth of a summer afternoon, the sting of a lover's betrayal, the taste of a grandmother's apple pie, the fear of a child lost in a storm. These were the collective, fragmented memories of generations, not just Oakhaven's, but perhaps a lineage far older, all dissolving and reforming within the entity's immense, silent consciousness. It was a cosmic tapestry woven from human experience, and it was consuming itself, feeding on its own creation. A low thrum resonated from the mass, a sound that bypassed my ears and reverberated directly in my skull. It was a voice, not of words, but of pure, overwhelming intent. Join. Become. It wasn't physical, but I felt its approach, a mental probe reaching for me. It sought to unravel me, to pluck my own memories like threads from a spool. Its cold metal pressed into my palm, a reminder of the fight. I felt my sense of self begin to fray, my individual history blurring, threatening to dissolve into the vast, impersonal current of its being. The struggle was brutal, not of muscle and bone, but of will and memory. It clawed at the walls of my mind, seeking purchase, seeking entry. It showed me visions of universal peace, of ultimate belonging, if only I would surrender. It promised an end to loneliness, an escape from the burden of individual thought. But I saw the cost. I saw the empty concourse, the silent, consumed memories. I saw the townspeople, their minds like shattered mirrors. With a desperate, guttural cry that felt torn from the very core of my being, I focused on the locket. I focused on the memory it represented, my grandmother's laugh, the feel of her hand in mine, the fierce, independent spark in her eyes. It was a singular, potent memory, a counterforce to the entity's diffuse assimilation. I poured my defiance into it, my anger, my love, my fear. The entity recoiled, a ripple passing through its vast, shimmering form. It had encountered resistance, an individual memory refusing to be swallowed. The reckoning had truly begun. The tendril of shadow, laced with shimmering light, was not merely a visual phantom, it was a hungry claw, reaching not for flesh, but for the very marrow of my being. It plunged into me, cold and vast, and I felt the sickening lurch as my mind became a scroll unfurling in an alien wind. Memories, bright and fragile as blown glass, were tugged from their moorings. The argument with my father, a distant echo from childhood, was just the first. Then came the warmth of my grandmother's hand, the scent of her lavender soap, the quiet joy of a summer afternoon spent skipping stones on the Oakhaven River. Each moment, each fragment of my existence, threatened to become a thread in a tapestry not my own. A profound violation, deeper than any physical pain, seized me. My identity, a lifetime woven from these very moments, was being dismantled. I fought, not with fists or a scream, but with the desperate, silent roar of my will. I clutched at the fading edges of a memory, the sting of salt spray on my face during a childhood trip to the coast, a memory intensely mine, utterly disconnected from Oakhaven's quiet, inland existence. It was a memory of freedom, of vastness beyond the entity's reach. It wasn't pain I sensed from it, but a moment of profound disorientation. My raw, unassimilated memory, a piece of something utterly other, had snagged in its vast, collective consciousness, a grid in its perfect, silent machinery. The mental probe, once a focused spear, fractured into 1,000 shimmering motes, each one a tiny, confused echo of my own scattered past. Then, the world around me dissolved into an endless, sterile expanse. The vaulted ceiling stretched into a gray, featureless sky. Columns of polished chrome reflected nothing but the sterile light that bled from unseen sources. This was the entity's preferred landscape, I realized, a monument to transit, to movement without purpose, to a journey that erased all individuality. The motionless escalators were a perfect metaphor for Oakhaven under its sway, always going up, but never arriving, never changing. I felt the entity here, not as a direct attack, but as a wounded, receding presence, a vast, wounded mind drawing back from the alien sensation of my defiance. Its tendrils, which had been everywhere, subtly weaving through the town's collective unconscious, now felt frayed, hesitant. The concourse shimmered, then fractured, and I was back, my body slumped against the cold stone of the town square's ancient well. The morning sun, a thin, watery light, struggled through the low-hanging clouds. The air was still, but the silence was different now. It was no longer the deep, pervasive quiet of stolen thought, but a fragile, almost mournful hush. A few townsfolk were beginning to stir, emerging from their homes, their faces etched with a new, bewildered confusion. The shopkeeper, usually so placid, stood on his porch, his gaze unfocused. He ran a hand over his chin, his brow furrowed, as if trying to remember a dream he couldn't quite grasp. My apples. He mumbled, his voice raspy, I was supposed to order the new crate. His eyes, though still distant, held a flicker of something new, a question, an attempt at recall. A colleague from the general store, a woman who had previously moved with robotic precision, now stumbled, catching herself on a lamppost. I remember a swing set here. For my children. Her eyes welled with tears, a raw emotion that had been utterly absent for weeks. The memories were returning, but they were jagged, incomplete, like shards of a shattered mirror. Some were there, sharp and painful, while others, crucial ones, seemed utterly gone, leaving gaping holes in their personal histories. They were not whole. The elder, his face a roadmap of ancient lines, sat on a bench, staring at the empty space where the town's old oak tree once stood. The one that had been cut down years ago but lived on in the collective memory. The children, he said. His voice a dry rustle of leaves, they used to play beneath its branches. I remember the laughter. But what were their names? Whose children were they? He clutched his head, a pained expression twisting his features. The entity was disrupted. It had retreated, wounded, its vast, insidious tendrils pulled back from the collective consciousness of Oakhaven. The town was not free, it was profoundly, irrevocably scarred. The townsfolk were waking, yes, but to a world that was half remembered, half forgotten, a patchwork of grief and confusion. Their memories were not fully restored, only fragmented, leaving them adrift in a sea of partial truths. I looked at their bewildered faces, at the dawning pain in their eyes, and a profound choice settled upon me. Oakhaven, my ancestral home, was broken. I could stay, offer what small comfort and guidance I could, help these shattered people try to piece together the remnants of their lives, to rebuild a community from the ashes of stolen memories. The image of the empty airport concourse with motionless escalators, a stark monument to lost journeys, burned in my mind. The choice was mine, but the cost, for Oakhaven, was already paid.